Hey guys, how's it going? Um, so we're talking about Chapter 13, the global consolidation of large nation states, 1859 to 1871. The frustrating thing about the 19th century and Palmer's treatment of it is that we get ahead and then we have to come back. We get ahead and then we have to come back. For example, um, Darwin publishes Origin of Species in 1859, right? So we're going to get to all that stuff, but right now we're basically just talking about large nation states, nationalism, which has been a key for us, specifically Italian and German unification, Austrian Empire and the dual monarchy, when Austria and Hungary agitates for its representation as half of the empire, and the emancipation of serfs in Russia, and how that's remarkably similar to the emancipation of the enslaved peoples of the United States, basically 4 years later. Well, really 2 years later. They happened at the same time. Okay, so we've gone over the concept of a nation state as opposed to a dynastic state, but I just wanted to. Oh, hello, that didn't really like. Oh, there we go. But nation state, right? By this time, by 1859, really, it's only Great Britain and France that have really become true nation states in the modern definition. Okay, so culture, right? A shared way of life, food, dress, behavior, ideals. Um, History, all the stuff that Hegel talks about with Germany, that's going to play a part in the unification of Germany, where he says basically there's the German spirit that will ultimately create the dialectical change. That the German spirit will be the thesis and something will be the antithesis. Maybe France. And that we have, as Germans, a common past, a common experience, especially going back to the 30 Years' War, when Germany, the German lands, the German princes, all those lands were basically like trampling grounds for Germany. For the armies of France and Sweden, and remember all that, when Germany was basically like torn to shreds. Language, of course, that's one of the most common denominators. Territory, a certain territory, right? France always wants to be from the Rhine to the Pyrenees in the south to the Alps in Italy, right? That's what all the French Bourbon and Valois kings always wanted, right? So nationality, common ethnic ancestry, that may or may not be true. Now, this is really important right here. This is going to play a part going into, this is for the Magyars, the Hungarians, for the Serbians. These guys are basically like, look, like our people, our common ethnic ancestry has been here since the fall of the Roman times, like 900s. The Magyars basically were like, we've been here since the 900s. And the Serbians were like, in 1384, we had this guy here, and yeah. So obviously religion is very, very important and still a factor. For example, do you think it's an accident that Prussia is predominantly Protestant and Austria is mostly Catholic? No, not an accident. That can go back to, remember the Edict of Potsdam, and when Louis XIV threw out all the Huguenots, all the Calvinists, and the Prussian king, I'm forgetting which Frederick or William it was, but the Prussian king was like, "We'll take you, we'll take you and your industrious attitudes." And I think obviously this contrasts to like nation state versus a dynastic state, and I have a slide about this next. But isn't it just interesting that it's February 3rd right now, and we just it's a snow day, which is allowing me to get this done, and the Super Bowl was yesterday, right? So, I mean, language activated there, culture, history, right? All contributing to, boom, nationalism. MetLife Stadium. Look at that American flag. That is huge. Lots of people there. Lots of people there doing American things, watching football, eating wings, right? Drinking Diet Pepsi, fueling the economy. Anyway, I digress. Okay, so it's all about loyalty when it comes down to it, right? Loyalty, not to a king or dynasty, but to an empire, but and this comes down to nation state versus dynastic state, to your people. Meaning, you know that the people down the street are Americans, or you want them to be Hungarians, or you want them to be Serbians. Your collective history, your culture. This has to do with myths and rituals and symbols. Just like Rousseau, we talked about Rousseau. When you change the symbols, when you change the rituals, like they tried to do in the French Revolution, doesn't work. People hang on to those. Interestingly, Great Britain and France were pretty much the only big nation states, right? So 1860s is basically the dawn of the nation state era. Interesting that both Italy and Germany unify with such national zeal and then become fascist. There's a correlation there. There's a definite linkage between ultra nationalism and fascism. Okay, so the other part is that remember that Europe had tried to stop Germany from becoming unified for centuries. Think back to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, right? You guys you princes can practice whatever religion you want and make your people practice whatever religion you want, as long as you don't become too powerful. Keep them separated, right? The Sun Tzu in The Art of War, basically like divide and conquer. That's what happened to Germany basically since the 16th century. Presence of Italy and Germany throws off the balance of power. This is key. We'll look at the end of this. We'll look at the last map, and it's just when there's a huge Germany there, right smack in the middle of Europe, it makes everybody feel panicky. Now, what is a state and what is a nation? This is important, and this is kind of a political science thing. A nation, you can have a nation and not have a state, but usually you can't have a state and not have a nation. A nation can be like Palestine, right? They don't necessarily have a nation. They don't have a state, meaning they don't have borders and a government that is recognized, but they are a nation. They have a shared culture. They have a shared religion, right? And now Israel didn't have that for a long time, the Israeli people, but now they have an actual state. So this is important with Serbia and Hungary. They're trying to weaken the Ottoman and Austrian empires. So as I said, the presence of self-government is the deciding factor. And we see this, Italy and Germany, the German nation, like Fichte. When Fichte writes what he writes, he says, to the German nation. Same with Martin Luther, to the German nation. They don't have a state yet, but they know that Germany is a thing. They know it's out there. They can feel it. And the American Confederacy, too, it tries to establish itself as a state, but it was kind of a nation before it even seceded, right? It had a different history than the North. It had a different culture. It had different thoughts about, enslaved peoples and how they were treated, right? So these are just examples. But you can have a nation, not necessarily a state. But how? By what means do you want to build this nation state? As always, war is the common denominator. War is still a great way to create nation states and inspire nationalism in your people. Obviously, Napoleon, we can blame Napoleon for a lot of this. And it always helps to have an enemy. France and Germany hate each other and did so for a long time. France always wanted to weaken the Habsburgs and stop unification of the universal monarchy. Think back to all the stuff preceding the 30 Years' War. The UK and France have hated each other since the 100 Years' War. Remember? Okay. All right. So Let me make sure that I have done all this right. Um, Nationalism, enhance the bond between governed and governed, break away from a larger political unit. That's in the case of Serbia, Hungary, stuff like that. And yeah, okay. So the big ones are going to be in this chapter. The Crimean War. Let's cover that first. Okay, Crimean War. This is, okay, Greece, let's get our bearings. Mediterranean Sea, this is modern day Turkey, Ottoman Empire. Serbia is right here. These are the Balkan states that are starting to gain independence from the Ottoman Empire, Austrian Empire. These are going to play a part here. Okay, so the main battles took place here on the Crimean Peninsula, which is why it's called the Crimean War. But it's all about the Dardanelles Straits, which are key. They're also key to Britain. Okay, so it's Crimean War is fought between 1853 and 1856, and it severely weakens both Russia and Austria, and this allows ultimately for the success of national movements in them. But Russia basically is picking a fight with the Turks for this strait, and Europe kind of comes to the Ottoman Empire's aid. So basically, it starts with a series of Russo-Ottoman conflicts. Nicholas I is still in power in Russia, and he moves troops into two Ottoman territories right here in the Balkans, Moldavia and Wallachia. And basically, he says he does so to protect Orthodox Christians from the Ottoman Empire, but it's baloney. He's after the Dardanelles. France, remember, go back to like 1527, and the Battle of Lepanto, right? I mean, the ways in which France teams up with the Turks to stop the Habsburgs. Like, France has always had an interest in the Ottoman Empire. They've always been buddies with the Austrian Empire. France is always interested in the Middle East. And they back up the Ottoman Empire again. Great Britain also backs up the Ottoman Empire because they do not want them to get the Dardanelles. That's because of trade routes, essentially. And Piedmont, Sardinia joins in as well because they basically see it as an opportunity to, like, hey, listen, we helped you out in the Crimean War. Maybe you can help us unify Italy, guys, right? And France will actually... Oh, hold on. Sorry about that, guys. It was the cable guy. Okay. So, essentially, when Nicholas I makes this kind of aggressive move, the British and the French invade. Austria takes these two provinces because they're the closest. Yeah, Austria is involved in this as well, by the way. And Russia, Nicholas dies, and I believe it's Alexander II comes to power, and he sues for peace. So this is important. Not only is Moldavia and Wallachia recognized as independent, free of the Ottoman Empire, not totally free, but recognized as kind of autonomous. Also, Serbia is recognized. This is important because Serbia is going to cause the First World War, and yeah. Let's see. The great powers agreed to basically come to the Ottoman Empire's aid whenever they thought it was good, or thought they needed to. Okay, a couple big things. Russia kind of like goes back with its tail between its legs. Austria is basically the way that it's weakened is that the great powers now kind of owe Piedmont Sardinia a favor. So that's going to play into Italian unification. Also, okay, there's a incredibly famous poem, "The Charge of the Light Brigade" by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I always thought it was Alfred Alfred Lloyd Tennyson for some reason. It's one of those things. He was the poet laureate for Queen Victoria, and we've got to watch this documentary on Queen Victoria because she's just absolutely brilliant. 1838 to 1901, she rules for 63 years. Crazy. Okay, so basically this Charge of the Light Brigade, written to memorialize the suicidal charge. It's an incredibly famous poem. I put the link down here, so if you guys want to read it, it's pretty beautiful. But like, this is an example of nationalism, right here, right? It's right here, and so that's a kind of cultural element that we can bring in. The other one is this guy, Roger Fenton. Roger Fenton was essentially the first war photographer. And this is the first time where war is covered by journalists and that photos are sent home and it's talked about in the newspaper with images like this. Wait for it. There we go. Yeah, those are cannonballs. This photograph is called The Valley of the Shadow of Death. So apparently this was the site of the charge that killed, like, basically all those British soldiers. So imagine seeing this. Imagine you open your newspaper, it's 1854 in Britain, and you're like, whoa. It's impactful. So here's some soldiers. This has never been done before, ever. And this is an example. This is a little bit later. This is from the American Civil War, but this is just 10 years later of technological change. I mean, imagine, this is why wars started to change and the impact of war started to change at home. It's just so much more visceral, and people react in a much more visceral way, and you can see why. This is another map. I thought this was helpful, just to remember that Hungary, becomes is kind of loses autonomy to Austria in 1699. That going back a ways. In those Austro-Ottoman wars. We didn't really cover that much, but those are kind of like tertiary. That we can go back to chapter 5 for that. So Ottoman Empire, obviously, regions winning independence. Greece in 1830, Serbia, it's kind of autonomous. Wallachia, Moldavia, but they're formally recognized as part of the Crimean War. They're actually recognized by the great powers. Egypt, I was just going to play important. Remember the Suez Canal, which is right here. Algeria is, after 1830, a French protectorate, French colony that's going to create problems with them after the Second World War. So this is just another map. This if you could zoom in on this, you would see why they're so the shipping routes are important. Okay, this is Florence Nightingale. She is the European equivalent of Clara Barton, who helps create the Red Cross in the United States, and this is incredibly important to women opening up to new professions, right, in the medical field. Okay, so this is a sample of the Illustrated London News, right, with a illustration of the Crimean War and a description. But this is, if you can imagine, what time. Okay, so let's move on to Italian unification. Here we got Mazzini, right? Remember Young Italy. He's kind of ultra-nationalist. His writings and the secret societies of Young Italy are incredibly important. This is Cavour. This is Cavour. And he's going to be essentially the liberal statesman. Okay, so essentially the question is, and we'll get to a map in a minute, but how did Piedmont, Sardinia kind of take charge? And we saw kind of the failed attempt in um, we saw the failed attempt in 1848 of Piedmont Sardinia to like make any progress, but 10 years later it's going to start to work. Okay, so remember terms like risorgimento, the resurgence, the movement. This is associated with mostly Mazzini, right? Renaissance glory. Mazzini's writings inspire all these things, and there is actually a Roman Republic that is short-lived in 1848, but it's pushed down by the Austrians and the French. Okay, so Piedmont, of whom Cavour is a part. Oh, the cable guy's here. I'll be right back. Okay, so remember, also just forgot to say this. The church is very important in this process, because essentially at first Pope Pius IX will support the idea of unification, but then in 1848, when everything goes haywire, he opposes it. And by 1870, the Pope is like, I'm just going to stay in the Vatican and nobody mess with me. And he even issues a infallibility of the Pope doctrine. Like I remember the document that we read like early on in the year where I believe it's Pope Gregory the Seventh, like in 1100, something like that, issues those decrees, right? So it's kind of going back to that. Okay, so the question, how did Piedmont take charge of this? So Cavour becomes prime minister of Piedmont Sardinia in 1852, and essentially he reforms the state, right? He becomes prime minister. So he turns it into a model state. He efficient government, representation, a strong parliament, expanding industrial economy, right? I mean, this had been Charles Albert had been the king in 1848 and realized that he needed to kind of start enfranchising more people, right? So this is a smart move to get someone like Cavour to do it practically. I mean, Cavour is kind of a liberal, but still not willing to go crazy with representation. So he gets Piedmont Sardinia to join the Crimean War to win French help, right? As I said before, to win French help for a war against Austria to free the subject states of Venetia and Lombardy. And Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, says, yeah, okay. And in 1859, French and Piedmontese, right, Piedmont Sardinia, they win important battles, and then revolution. People across Italy kind of take this as a signal for revolution, and it's basically like, remember, Italy is still kind of. Let me get a map here. Italy's still. Here we go. So here's Piedmont Sardinia. Here's Lombardy and Venetia. That's what Piedmont and Sardinia want. As they start winning battles against the Austrians, revolutions start to break out all down the peninsula, because people say like, oh, well, this is our chance. And this puts the French in a bad position because they've been protecting the Pope since 1849. And so the French say maybe we should kind of get out of this position, and they make a separate peace with the Austrians. And the crux of this first war is that the Austrians say, okay, we'll stop the war, we'll give Lombardy to Piedmont Sardinia, but we're holding on to Venetia for now, and we will basically like stop the war. But a lot of these states basically say, and notice down here, annexed to Sardinia in 1861, establishes Kingdom of Italy, a lot of these states say, well, we want to be with Piedmont Sardinia because we think that they are the strongest and we don't care what the French say. So these states join Piedmont Sardinia, right? So now Italy is kind of here, here, and here. It's not yet Rome. It's not yet Venetia. Okay. And in turn, Napoleon III recognizes Italy, okay, as a state, but he gets Nice from Piedmont Sardinia. Nice is nice. Nice is a nice place. And Savoy, and right here. Savoy's right here. Okay, so you guys, hopefully, you're following me. Okay, so it's a nice exchange. Now, basically, there are three Italies. There's this Italy, there's Venetia, and then there's Rome. Basically, the Piedmontese states, right? Then the Papal states, and oh, I'm sorry, and there's still the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. So that for some reason that's still there. Okay, now for this guy, and this guy is really the guy who makes it all come together. Yep. So I could not help this. Giuseppe Garibaldi looks remarkably like the most interesting man in the world. Really? You know, don't you see it? I can't help but see it. And Garibaldi's career was really kind of crazy. He went all over the world. He was pretty much the most interesting man in the world at the time. So maybe this guy is modeled after this guy. Wouldn't surprise me. Some facts, right? He fought pirates. He was twice an admiral, 7 times a general, government official in 5 different countries, commander-in-chief. Oh, I can't believe I did that. Commander-in-chief of the Uruguayan army. In Uruguay, in South America, in their battle of independence. Basically, he was sort of a mercenary there. He defended the Roman Republic, 1848, interestingly. And then he was exiled. He lived in Manhattan making candles. And if you play Quiz Up, that's actually that is actually a question. He was a novelist, definitely a ladies' man. Had several mistresses all over the world. And in 1863, Lincoln actually offered him a high command in the Union Army, which is pretty crazy. And in a letter to Lincoln, he basically said, "Look, I'm only going to join if you make me totally a general of all forces. I won't join in any other circumstance. And by the way, I think you are the great liberator for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation." So Giuseppe Garibaldi is the guy who coined that phrase. Some interesting things right here, right? only one to appear on a U.S. and Soviet stamp. I thought that was interesting. And yeah, sorry about that. And let's see. These are battles. The Battle of Solferino in this first war, 1859. It's a famous painting of it. And one of the reasons why Louis Napoleon kind of makes a separate piece with the Austrians is because what? I can't believe that. Sorry about that. I apologize. Yeah, there were heavy losses at Solferino, so he ducked out. Now, going back to Garibaldi. Okay, so basically he organizes an impromptu army of about 1,000 men called the Red Shirts. Red Shirts, that's important. They land in Sicily, right here. They land in Sicily and easily take it, again with popular support. Basically, he's so legendary that once he lands in Sicily, like everybody's like, "Oh my God, it's Garibaldi," and they all go to fight for him. And they march all the way to Rome, right? And they want to liberate the Papal States. But Cavour says, no, that will really be bad. Please don't do that. And Garibaldi says, okay, all right, I'll listen to you. You seem to know what you're doing, seem to be, you seem to have everything together. So Cavour kind of puts things together. He puts a parliament together, and in 1861 they declare Italy unified with Victor Emmanuel II. I don't have a picture of him for whatever reason. Victor Emmanuel II, King of Piedmont, as the first king of Italy. They're still missing two states, Venice and Rome, but they will come over. Venice is added in 1866, and Rome is added in 1870. That's right here. Okay? So that's how Italy becomes Italy. But there are still problems. Okay? There are Italians living outside of Italy. There are Italians living over here and over here. This will stick in the craw of those who will later call themselves fascists. Okay, and they will basically be like, we must reincorporate all those who represent the Italian nation, right? So they're basically called they're basically living in the Austrian Empire, and they're called Italia Irredenta, and nationalists hope to recover these Italia Irredenta, these kind of Italians who are displaced, essentially. When Rome's taken in 1870, this is another problem. A rift, I've talked about this before, a rift between the Italian state and the church. This lasts for decades. The Pope condemns the new state. He lives in isolation in the Vatican. This puts Catholics in Italy in a conflict between their duties to the state and their obligations to the church. So this is problematic. Also, just like the United States, this area is way more industrialized, and this area is way more agrarian. So industrial north, agrarian south, they don't feel that much connection to each other, and they kind of don't work well together. And also, liberalism is like non-existent here. They are still very much we're going to do things our way. Suffrage is limited. Like, we're going to do things, not our way, do things our way. Not Frank Sinatra. We're going to do things the aristocratic way. We're going to protect class structure as much as we can. Okay? Okay, so that's Italian unification. All right, let's go through Germany. Okay, so this guy. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great question of the day be decided, but by Blut and Ehre. Blut and Ehre. Blood and iron. I'm sorry, Blut and Eisen. Blut und Eisen, not Blut und Ehre. I don't know what that is. I don't speak German. But Blut, it sounds better in German. Blut und Eisen. And I thought this was pretty, yeah, just a little a play on the Shepard Fairey poster of Obama. Okay, so Bismarck. Bismarck, we've talked about this before, but Bismarck is Realpolitik incarnate. Okay, and he becomes German Chancellor in 1862, but a couple things before that. So the basic question is, how did Prussia forge German unification, right? And just remember that German disunity in Central Europe had basically created Western Europe, because Central Europe there was a power vacuum there for so long, basically, throughout the 16th century, basically until 1815, right? After the Congress of Vienna, and Napoleon basically forced German nationalism to kind of coalesce. This disunity allowed the rise of Western Europe, the Atlantic states, pushed trade that way, and it also kind of allowed the Russian Empire to form, because no one, there was essentially this nebulous buffer between Western Europe and Russia. France had loved this. England had been fine with this, pretty much everybody. But Napoleon changed all that, right? And then guys like Herder, Fichte, and Hegel, of course, they stressing that German superiority was innate and that German superiority was more important. The nation of Germany was more important than individual liberty. This is key for the fascism that will arise later. That the German nation and German superiority was more important than individual liberty. Um, and all these guys used history, the idea of German history, to fuel this stuff. Um, okay, remember also that the revolutions in 1848 weakened any kind of liberalism that was trying to coalesce in Germany, and the old political structures had been restored, like the Junkers and yeah, the Junkers and the army especially. Um, Now, also at this time, Germany is industrializing like crazy. They are absolutely like a new economic force. Remember the trade union called the Zollverein, Zollververein, I think. Zollverein. I think I just misspelled that. But so it's rapidly industrializing. And um, basically everybody in Prussia is saying, look, it looks like if we unify, um, we could really make something happen here. So everybody's kind of willing to unify, and there's a inertia, there's a force behind it. Okay, so its population had also doubled in 50 years since Napoleon, so that helped expand the army, and expanded the collection of taxes. Um, but taxes in it is an issue here because the Prussian Diet, or the Prussian legislature, um, kind of didn't want to keep funding the army for whatever reason, and when they refused to collect more taxes, like the Kaiser, basically, I believe it was Kaiser Frederick Williams. I don't remember. That, doesn't matter. But whoever it is, appointed Bismarck as chancellor in 1862. Basically, he did not like liberalism, parliaments, democracy, socialism, materialism. He didn't care for anything. He just wanted whatever was good for Prussia and for Germany. So this is the Prussian Diet, kind of the parliament building. So the Prussian parliament says, no, we don't want to raise taxes. Bismarck says, I don't care what you say. I'm going to raise taxes anyway for the army. And he collects them from a willing populace, despite what they say. And that's when he gives his first speech, which is the Blood and Iron speech. He basically says that decisions will be decided by blood and iron, not by discussion or votes. Interesting. So let's move to the map. So really, so 1862, this is Prussia in the red. And that's when Bismarck comes to power. First, they get an opportunity to go to war with Denmark to get Schleswig-Holstein up here. This is a very important piece of land. Just like Alsace-Lorraine down here will be a very important piece of land. So the Danes, basically, they were threatening to incorporate some Germans living in an adjacent province, right? The Denmark was threatening to control this, which was independent, and Prussia said no, and they basically convinced Austria Bismarck convinces Austria to join him in the war against the Danes, like the Danish-Prussian war, right? And they each take, I think Prussia gets Schleswig and Austria gets Holstein. But Bismarck's whole plan is he's just trying to basically bait Austria into a war, and kind of orchestrates tension with them. basically because he wants to eliminate Austria as a contender for leadership of United Germany. Right? He basically wants Prussia to be the leader, and he works it with the British, he works it with the Italians, he works it with Russians, and France is kind of preoccupied with its war in Mexico, and he gets kind of approval, um, and he goes to war with Austria in 1866, 1867. Well, actually, in 1866. I mean, it's over so fast. It's the 7 Weeks War, right? And mostly, and thanks to Mark for pointing this out, mostly it's because of this. It's the needle gun. Basically, this is like a bolt action. You pull it back and you put the bullet in and you fire it. It's a drastic improvement over the musket, where you have to like load it and put the powder in. A musket, maybe a good shot can get off 3 shots in a minute. This can just be like bullet, pull it back, fire. Bullet, pull it back, fire. I mean, it's just like the rate of fire is just ridiculous. So they go to war with Austria. They win really, really handily. Um, so they destroy Austria, or just basically take their holdings here. They have control of Schleswig-Holstein and basically take over all this territory. So they set up the North German Confederation in 1867 after the 7 Weeks War. It's a 22 state North German Confederation. And Italy helps them in this, and that's when Italy gets Venetia. Okay? Um, but the southern states, these don't join. And this is kind of an interesting like religious tension here, because these states are Catholic and mostly these states are Protestant. Um, okay, so that the King of Prussia at this time is King William the First, and let's see, I believe this is King William the First. Yeah, okay, he becomes the first German emperor after. Okay, we're not there yet. So the North German Federation comes into existence as a federal state. Okay, as a federal state, which I'll explain in a second. With the King of Prussia, King William I as its head, a bicameral legislature, upper house and lower house, and it's elected by universal male suffrage, which is interesting. But essentially, Bismarck is just he's just using democracy to garner support for the new Germany. And he's even negotiating with guys like this guy, Ferdinand Lassalle, German socialist, who essentially is not as crazy, not meaning crazy, not as orthodox as Marx. And he's basically like, okay, if he's basically getting co-opted into the state, and Marx is very disappointed in this, and Lassalle is basically seen as a socialist sellout. And then, in order to win the southern states that I said were mostly Catholic, down here, to get them into the New Germany, Bismarck is like, we gotta start another war. And this time he's like, we gotta start a war with France, so that we can basically invade this territory and claim it as our own. And essentially there's a dynastic conflict over Spain, and France wants, remember how France has interest as the Bourbon lineage in Spain, and Bismarck meets with I believe it's Louis Napoleon, or not Louis Napoleon III, but maybe the other prime minister of France. Anyway, they have a meeting. It goes fine, but there's a telegram that's sent, and Bismarck rewords it in a way that basically insults the French. This is called the Ems dispatch. This is down here, and you can see he basically like modifies the telegram and like fakes intercepting the telegram and like publishes it in the newspapers, and like it's a whole big brouhaha. This is the Ems dispatch. The Ems dispatch. And the French get all insulted as planned, and they declare war. France declares war. Then when they do this, the Italians take Rome. They take that opportunity to take Rome as the French have to withdraw their troops there. And then, I mean, the French are utterly defeated, mercilessly by the needle gun. Less than 2 months. They're defeated. Napoleon III is captured at the Battle of Sedan. German armies get to Paris. I mean, it's just embarrassing how quickly they fall. And they basically France has to declare the Third Republic because Napoleon III is captured. Their emperor is gone. And this is gonna lead to some stuff. But first, I mean, imagine like what Louis XIV was doing in his grave when this was happening. Right, here's King William I, who becomes emperor of Germany. Here's Bismarck, and this is the Hall of Mirrors. This is in Versailles. Louis XIV is like, oh my God, in his grave. He's rolling over in his grave. Okay, so the fallout in France to this, and this is in chapter 14. We'll go over this a little bit more. But is the Paris Commune. And in 1871, by the way, this last whole thing, right? That's the Franco-Prussian War. This is the Franco-Prussian War. This is another map about how all this came into existence. German Confederation, all this stuff. Alsace-Lorraine is ceded to the German, and this is important for World War I. Alsace-Lorraine is always fought over, just like Schleswig-Holstein is always fought over. But after the Franco-Prussian War, here's another map view. This is all this 1871. All this is Germany, all of it, which is just crazy. At least I think so. But in France, the Paris Commune. Basically, there's and we'll get into it more, but basically there's a ridiculous socialist uprising in the power vacuum after Napoleon III is gone. This is kind of like the Fronde that happens after the 30 Years' War, when there's an uprising after the 30 Years' War in Paris that scares Louis XIV. I've talked about that before. Here's another, the barricades go up again, even though the streets were supposed to be widened. But this is more of like the National Guard versus the army kind of thing. So it's partially like peasants and workers. But we'll get into this more. But France is really, really hurt from this. So let's go back to this map and just kind of say right away, Germany. Actually, let's go down to this map, because this map is really this is Europe in 1871. You have unified Italy. You have the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Ottoman Empire kind of limping along. Right away, when Germany is unified, it is the strongest state on the continent. The strongest state. Its economy is growing like crazy. And remember when I said it's a federal state? It's kind of like the United States in a way, because each member state is a state. Like they have their own local government. They king or prince is still there, but they have their own laws, own constitution. So each state has its own laws, own constitution, but Prussia is clearly dominant. Unification had been by Prussia, and the aristocracy, the Junkers, are solidified. Right, they're still going to be the officers of the army and the bureaucracy. And the important thing is the Prussian Parliament. And let's go back to that building up there. the Prussian Parliament is essentially, it just capitulates to Bismarck's success, right? It legitimizes the taxes that he wanted to collect. It is elected by universal male suffrage, but it's just an illusion of democracy, right? The ministers are only responsible to the emperor and to Bismarck, and it's just, I mean, imagine the balance of power shifting in Europe, right? I mean, imagine the balance of power shifting. Okay, so Austria, we have to just touch on Austria and Russia, and then we're done. Sorry, this is taking longer than I thought. So how did Austria fare? How did Austria do after its defeat to Prussia in 1866? Right, it's still got this problem, right? And as we talked about last time, still got this problem of Germans, Italians, Magyars, Romanians, Slovenians, Czechs, Serbs, Croats, Poles, Slovaks. Right, I mean, it's, yeah. So they have even more pressure to come to terms with the multitude of ethnicities, nationalities. After 1848, it had attempted a program of Germanization, right? A program of centralization, political centralization, industrialization, abolition of serfdom, and essentially, like, kind of like you all better become German. You guys should become German, and obviously ethnic groups oppose this. The Magyars, the Hungarians, are the strongest ones that had nearly achieved independence in 1848. So, essentially, long story short, they are getting so powerful and getting agitating for so much power that they have to create a dual monarchy. It makes the Kingdom of Hungary and the Austrian Empire equal, each with its own parliaments, own laws, its own language. They would have a common emperor and common finance, military, foreign affairs, ministries. The Hungarians are very happy with this. Obviously, the Slavs, the Serbs, the Croats, the Czechs, Poles, everybody else is basically like, hey, that's kind of not cool, because they're not only kind of subject to Austria, but they're now subject to the Hungarians as well. And what do the Hungarians do? They basically say, we're going to remain the dominant class of landlords, and all you other guys, we're going to turn around. Now that we're in power, we're going to turn around and kind of subjugate you, all the Slavic peoples and the poor rural proletariat. Okay, so that's not great. That will lead to problems. Okay, but there's a more thorough explanation in Palmer on that. So if you want to go through that, you can. Okay, on to Russia. Essentially, Tsar Alexander II. So, he essentially really wants to westernize because of the disaster of the Crimean War. His military got beat pretty badly. Serfdom basically has really weakened the country. There's no unity, and he's still dealing with the things that Peter the Great dealt with. Westernization, the forces kind of supporting westernization, and the Slavophiles, right, who believe that, of the unity of Slavic peoples and the uniqueness of the Russians, and that, we should resist change of Western Europe, right? And remember that his government is still very autocratic. He rules by decree. He relies on the police and the army. But there are these liberal ideas that are coming in from the West, right? Serfdom is still very onerous, brutal, and it's weakening the country. And there's a rising class of intelligentsia, the educated classes, and they're going to play a crucial role. And so essentially, they decide that the first step is to emancipate the serfs, right? They decide that we can't do serfdom anymore. Partly because of the intelligentsia, they basically agitate for change, and they are saying, look, like, this is something, this is going to go away at some point. So in the Emancipation Act of 1861, I think it's amazing that Russia let its serfs go before the United States let the enslaved peoples of the South go. I think that's fascinating. So it made the serfs legally free and gave them land. And here's a picture of some serfs. Here's an amazing painting of serfs. Imagine Red Square in the mid 19th century. Serfs doing whatever they can to kind of get by. So it made the serfs legally free and gave them land, but they had to make redemption payments. So these redemption payments to the former landlords for this land. Essentially, it's a horrible deal for the serfs and a really good deal for the landowners. The aristocracy benefits from emancipation. They're free of having to care for the serfs, right? They're getting clear possession of half the land, and then earning redemption payments on the land that they had to give up. So they did have to give up land, but now they're basically like collecting rent. The peasant land was basically legally, collectively owned by the village council. And this is how the redemption payments were made. But this village council, or mir, MIR, had the authority over the peasants and could prevent them from leaving the land if they still had redemption payments to make. Basically, the government it's like slavery in anything but name, like serfdom by another name. In addition, the government forbade the selling or renting of these peasant lands to outsiders. Therefore, they're keeping the economy very limited. They're keeping the economy very anti-capitalistic because if what are you going to do with the land? Okay, so Alexander II tries to go one step further. He tries to make more reforms, right? He's like, okay, what else can I do to try and bring Russia into westernization? Freedom to travel abroad, reduction of government control over the university and the press, and this allows journals like the Polar Star, edited by this guy, Herzen, and Herzen agitates for things like overhaul of the legal system, the establishment of public trials, equality before the law, kind of elected districts and councils, education, infrastructure, public welfare. But Alexander creates some of these. He gives some of these, but not all of them. Mostly in the legal department, legal system. But this guy, Bakunin, okay, he's more dangerous. And these are both intelligentsia, but this guy's more moderate, and Bakunin is basically the guy behind the anarchists. And they espouse this kind of more revolutionary development in Russia. All right, so the intelligentsia, obviously, they're going to be at odds with the Russian government, where guys like Herzen are frustrated. These guys are frustrated by the lack of real reforms. They only go halfway. Now, some of these guys see themselves as nihilists, and not yet in the Nietzsche nihilist version, but nihilists in the denial of the existence of any basis of knowledge. It's right here. But essentially, a political movement that sought to bring about a socially just new society by destroying the existing one, right? And Bakunin is going to say, well, how are we going to do that rather than terrorism, assassination, right? That's what we got to do. So Bakunin basically says, and we have to assassinate as many government officials as we can, because these modest reforms are only masking the reality of oppression of the professional revolutionary whose only goal is only morality. There's one of the main organizations called the People's Will, and they finally are able to kill Alexander II in 1881. And this just basically brings Alexander III to the throne, and he just cracks down on everybody. So it really nihilism in the Russian sense, and terrorism, all this stuff. It just basically the attempts to reform just lead to bloodshed and to more repression. Okay, so the rest of chapter 13 was kind of about the United States Civil War and the creation of Canada and the industrialization of Japan. Essentially, what all you need to know is that the Civil War in the United States was really the only worst war. It was a horrible war. Up. Hold on. Sorry. Basically, all you need to know about the American Civil War is that European governments tended to favor the South because it was most like the rest of Europe at the time, and the idea is that the southern states are kind of like the Hungarians trying to gain independence from Austria a bit, in a way. At least that's Palmer's take on it. And let's see. The Dominion of Canada, the English giving dominion to Canada is basically the first example of successful and peaceful bequeathment of independence by one large country to another. And then Japan essentially just is westernized after 1853 when the American Commodore Perry kind of pushes his way into Edo Harbor, Tokyo Harbor, and essentially just says, okay, you're going to trade with us now. So, yeah, that opens up Japan to westernization. And I just wanted to leave you with this. This is Europe in 1815. Okay. You can kind of see that. And this is Europe in 1871. 1815 and 1871. All right. Hope that helps.